Yeah, also so welcome everyone. Thanks for everyone who makes this happen. It is actually quite the effort, and I'm super grateful for everybody's attention and interest. I'm glad that you're all here. And let's see, I need to share my screen and we'll get started. Today we are going through the title of the chapter is The Breath of Life. And the reason, a lot of the titles of the chapters were sort of the theme, I guess, was God images or names of different, deities, I guess. And one of those is the breath of life, which is actually a pretty important one for Carl Jung, and for those of us who are in recovery as well. Uh, and we'll talk a lot more about it later, but we have the spiritus contra spiritum paradox. That was a Carl Jungian, the Jungian idea, and that's kind of where this comes from. Breath of life is spiritus. So yeah, we could have also called. I could have called this chapter um, the relative God image as well, because that's what we're going to spend a lot of time talking about. So this is the textbook, I guess, the Shadow of a Figure of Light. I do like to mention early on for those who are new that this is not. This shouldn't be under this shouldn't be a replacement for work in the 12 steps, for work with a sponsor, for work in whatever 12-step fellowship you find yourself in. We're not I'll probably talk a lot about AA because I was pulling from Bill Wilson's writings when I wrote this book, so there's a lot of references sort of implicit just to Alcoholics Anonymous, but also I tried to write a book that was applicable for people in every 12-step fellowship. And we'll get into that more. So I try to, veer away from just calling myself an alcoholic or anything like that, and just really try to focus on the more sort of universal aspect of this disease of addiction. Um, Books, as Duncan said, they're available on my website, cody-peterson.com. Also, on the website, I post these videos. There's a videos tab, so the videos get posted eventually. So most of them are up. I didn't post the one from last week yet. I haven't had time, but I'll probably do that today. And hopefully, if you missed the classes from the last couple weeks, you can go back and catch up. So, and I'll try to cover the stuff that needs to be covered in the lesson today to sort of rehash or recap where necessary. So what we're talking about here, really in this whole part of the book, part two, is the evolution of the God image, right? And we've talked about this concept of the transformation of the God image, and that the symbols that we're talking about, which God is a symbol or the God image is a symbol, these symbols are dynamic, right? It means that they can grow and change. They're sort of fluid. Um, and that's a distinct characteristic of a symbol, right? They're living. They're sort of like these living organisms, and as such, they can really meet us where we're at. So as we change, the symbols change, right? And they sort of meet us where we are. Um, we've also said that in this journey inward, right? Like if we were to do shadow work, then what we encounter first of all when we turn inside is our concept of God, or we encounter the God image. This is the foundation of the human psyche. And the God image is really sort of it's like the unconscious basis of consciousness, right? And so what happens is, as the ego, the human ego has sort of been developing slowly over time. The Jungians, I think, as Jung and Edinger says that with Descartes, when he says "I think, therefore I am," that was sort of that was like the point in history when we can say that the modern ego was sort of developed, like it was in existence. I think, therefore I am. But as the ego develops, so does the God image, right? Those two things grow alongside each other. And this is really important because what it means is that the Western ego, which is like most of us, most likely practically all of us in this meeting, for example, we're Westerners, right? We think in a Western way. So our ego has evolved alongside our Western God images. And that's important to understand because these two psychological complexes, right? The God image and the ego, they're sort of attuned to each other like at the same frequency. And so if the goal of psychological transformation or of spiritual awakening is to have an evolution of the ego, so to further develop the ego so that we're not ridden by anxiety or that we don't suffer with addiction anymore, whatever it is, that the unconscious component that has to morph is the God image. And that I'm not going to be able to transform my Western ego with some other kind of God image, right? I've got to use the God image that's programmed into my psyche. Um, so, but we have a problem, you see. There's this thing that we call the spiritual malady, which essentially says that the Western God image is no longer it's not fulfilling its need anymore for the Western psyche, right? As Nietzsche said, God is dead. And so this is the problem with Western culture. And this is really the essence of the spiritual malady. So this is Edward Edinger. And I love Edinger. I pull from him so much. This is what he says. The history of Western man can be viewed as a history of its God images, the primary formulations of how humankind orients itself to the basic questions of life, its mysteries. It was Jung's phenomenological discovery that the Western God image has undergone a whole series of transformations in the course of its evolutionary and historical development, and that we are now on the verge of another such evolutionary leap in the development of the God image. We are right on the verge of witnessing the birth of a new God image as a result of Jung's work. It is an idea he develops most explicitly in his book, Answer to Job. So it's important to understand about Edward Edinger. He was sort of like he's like an apostle for Carl Jung. A lot of Jungians don't necessarily agree with Edinger's idea here that the new God image will result out of Jung's work. Interestingly, I've shown that within the 12 steps, that Bill Wilson essentially introduced a similar sort of God image, right? But it didn't emerge out of Jungian psychology per se, but it actually grew alongside it, which I think tells us a lot about because there is certainly the development of a new God image is underway, but the question as to where it's going to come from, nobody really knows, right? So we're going to talk about Answer to Job just briefly. So Job, you'll recall, there's a story about Job in the Old Testament, and and so and this story plays a key kind of role, I guess, in the evolution of the God image. Okay, so Job was a perfect and upright man. He was a wealthy man in the story. This is just a myth. And he was like this great, very obedient, humble person. And then Satan comes along, and Jung tells us, that Satan is the only being in the universe to have Yahweh's ear, and Yahweh is the God of the Old Testament, right? That's God the Father. And so Satan comes along and basically says, hey Yahweh, why don't you let me tempt Job? Why don't you let me harass Job? Why don't you let me make Job's life a living hell? For whatever reason, the God image said, okay, go for it. And so what happens then is the devil starts to really just throw all kinds of problems into Job's life. And through it all, Job he refuses to curse God. He never speaks poorly about God or questions anything, right? And so Jung points out, right, that this sort of problem kind of develops. Now, the reductive interpretation, right, that we've talked about, the reductive interpretation, like the really basic kind of surface level interpretation of the story of Job, is that it's meant to teach us what it is for a righteous person or an obedient person to undergo to experience suffering. Jung, however, takes the interpretation of this thing to a whole new level, and this idea right here gives us an insight into the way Jung conceived of these religious images, and it's a really, really profound way to look at it. So this is what Jung says. and this is in the book Answer to Job, which I highly recommend. It's a short book. A curious change comes over Yahweh's behavior after the Job episode. There can be no doubt that he did not immediately become conscious of the moral defeat he had suffered at Job's hands. In his omniscience, of course, this fact had been known from all eternity, and it is not unthinkable that the knowledge of it unconsciously brought Yahweh into the position of dealing so harshly with Job in order that he himself should become conscious of something through this conflict and thus gain new insight. And so what he's saying here is that, you know, that, and this is an interesting psychological mirror, right? But it's that the self, this overarching thing that's omniscient, understood this problem in Yahweh, that Yahweh was failing to see himself very clearly. And so what emerges then is this conflict, right? That Yahweh winds up creating a conflict for himself. And the conflict is that the jealous and angry God of the Old Testament is forced to do some self-reflecting, right? And what happens is that the God figure realizes, and this is Jung's interpretation, but that the God figure realizes that the only way to save face really is to become human himself. Because now what happens is Job is essentially really kind of demonstrating a higher level of conscious awareness, because he refused to curse God. And God couldn't really see past the fact that he was allowing the devil to give Job a hard time. So this is the conflict, right? And so what happens out of this, the development of the God image, is then that God decides to become human. And this is what Jung says. The victory of the vanquished and oppressed is obvious. Job stands morally higher than Yahweh. In this respect, the creature has surpassed the creator. As always, when an external event touches on some unconscious knowledge, this knowledge can reach consciousness. The event is recognized as a déjà vu, and one remembers a pre-existent knowledge about it. Something of the kind must have happened to Yahweh. Job's superiority cannot be shrugged off. Hence, a situation arises in which real reflection is needed. That is why Sophia steps in. She reinforces the much-needed self-reflection and thus makes possible Yahweh's decision to become man. It is a decision fraught with consequences. He raises himself above his earlier primitive level of consciousness by indirectly acknowledging that the man Job is morally superior to him, and that therefore he has to catch up and become human himself. Had he not taken this decision, he would have found himself in flagrant opposition to his omniscience. Yahweh must become man precisely because he has done man a wrong. He, the guardian of justice, knows that every wrong must be expiated, and wisdom knows that moral law is above even him. Because his creature has surpassed him, he must regenerate himself. And so then what happens is, 500 years later, in the myth that's emerging and that it's evolving alongside of this God image, is we have the immaculate conception of Jesus Christ, right? So Jesus is born, and in this way, God becomes man. And so this is just sort of an overarching kind of archetypal way to look at this evolution. And we want to, what's interesting here is that this evolution that's taking place in the myth is also taking place in the psyche, the collective psyche, right? That and what was happening was that as the culture was developing, we were becoming more and more conscious, more and more awake, more and more self-reflective. So Jesus then comes, and he's literally the first real reflection of the self. And there's an interesting way to look at this. Is almost like this. If you like, I find that the whole concept of us living in a simulation and that artificial intelligence is actually sort of running the show. That's an easy way of imagining this in terms of if the AI is the self, then the AI is dimly conscious, but that it uses the human experience to become more conscious of itself. So that's sort of that's the framework that Jung is kind of giving to this myth. So I want to do something here. And I'm going to do this at the end too. So now basically it's just like a really quick contemplation. So whoever's here, if you're listening to this on the video, this is what we're going to do. It's kind of like an active imagination, which was Jung's phrase for this way of kind of bringing images or symbols forward out of the unconscious and like bringing them into consciousness, right? And the reason I want to do this is because I really hope that the reader, as they're reading the book, will start to kind of try to understand these images and like the God and the higher power and the self and all this stuff, that they are symbolic entities, right? And so this is this is what I want to do. I'm going to give a prompt in just like a couple seconds. And what I want you to do is just imagine whatever image sort of emerges when I give you the prompt. I just want you to take a note of it and just sort of like latch onto it. Okay. So I'm going to try to calm down a little and breathe a little lightly so you can't hear me breathing. We'll just take a few quick breaths and then I'll give you the prompt and then just imagine the image. Okay. So here we go. So a few moments of silence. Okay. I want you to picture the God image. Just picture the God image. Okay. So now chances are you had all kinds of random images pop up in your head. There's probably 50 different images if there's 50 people on the meeting. What I want you to do is just hold on to that image, okay? And maybe later on, if you journal, maybe write about it, just write it down. It wouldn't hurt to Google the symbolism about the image if you have a book of symbols or something. Maybe try to figure out what it would mean if the image appeared to you in a dream. So just whatever it is, I just want you to look at this and actually see. The thing is, so I did this exercise earlier, and the image that came up for me was like a badger, like a mean animal, like in a cave, basically just growling at me. And I thought, well, that's an interesting idea or an interesting symbol for the God image, but it actually fits, right? If I do a little, if I just go a little bit deeper, it fits very well. So the question is then, this is the thing, is that these images, when we do this type of activity or this sort of contemplation, this active imagination, the symbols that appear are coming to us directly from the unconscious, just like our dreams are. And so and it's just important because to tie this into the idea of the God image, right, is that when we talk about the God image, we're not actually talking about God itself. Okay. The image is the archetype. And so and the image could be that image that we just dreamt up. Okay. So and hopefully I can make this point today, is that those images that come out of the psyche are the ones that are actually the most powerful. The ones that somebody hung out in heaven, they don't really have that much power. This is Edinger again. He says, the book of Job is a landmark in the long evolutionary development of a divine drama. So we're talking about a divine drama here. That's from Answer to Job. Edinger comments this: the remarkable idea in this sentence is the phrase divine drama, referring to a dynamic process. The God image is not a static entity. The archetype of the God image, what we live by, whether we know it or not, is part of a dynamic process, a living entity, a living process that moves, that unfolds, that develops and undergoes transformations. More specifically, the God image, the term God image, is synonymous with a particular aspect of the self. That would be called the collective self, a transpersonal center shared by a whole body of humanity with more than one individual reference. So essentially then, so I've said this before, I thought I stole it from Joseph Campbell, but I can't find the quote, is that myth is the collective dream of the human race or of a culture. Myth is the dream of a larger culture, of like an era, right? That's what myth is. But dreams then are the myths of the individual, right? That's and so And then those two things have a lot of interaction and interconnectedness with each other. So now we're going to jump back into the book. This is a quote that I have in the book, like in the second page of the chapter, that's from Jung, and it's one of my favorite quotes. He says, "All ages before us have believed in gods in some form or another. Only an unparalleled impoverishment of symbolism could enable us to rediscover the gods as psychic factors, that is, as archetypes of the collective, of the unconscious. Heaven has become for us the cosmic space of the physicists, and the divine empyrean a fair memory of things that once were. But the heart glows, and a secret unrest gnaws at the roots of our being." And so, it's good news, I guess, to understand that everybody's everybody's restless, irritable, and discontented, right? Everybody suffers from that thirst for wholeness that we understand so well, being in the 12 steps. And interestingly too, Jung tells us here that we're not the first to sort of to read. He says we rediscovered the gods as a psychic factor, right? So the gods always were a psychic factor, really. We're the Western culture is the one who decided that the gods weren't a psychic factor. We're really one of the only civilizations, for sure, that actually sort of project the god images out into the universe. So, and this is a problem, says Jung. There's this impoverishment of symbolism, right? So, so, and the problem, I guess, the basis of the spiritual malady is twofold. First of all, we can't, so science won't let us buy into these images as facts anymore, right? Like we just know that, like, the earth probably didn't flood 4,000 years ago. Like there's archaeological evidence, like there's just proof, like we know that the Garden of Eden, it's just there, science is like disproving these things as factual historical events. But then the problem that we have as Westerners too is that we are so hyper rationalistic that we also refuse to buy into these ideas or these images as symbols. And so what happens is we've cut ourselves off, right? We've cut ourselves off from the numinosity. We've cut ourselves off from our connection to the unconscious, which also, as we're going to see as we go through the next few chapters, is really our connection to the earth and basically to the world around us, right? The symbols are those things that keep us connected. We saw in the last chapter that the word symbol means to throw together, right? And so the symbols are the things that bring us back together and bring us back into a state of unity. So this is why then a psychological method or a psychological approach is so important, right? Because we can't access this stuff by the metaphysical approach anymore. We can't see these things as actual facts. So really the only way to find access to this is Carl Jung, was to use a psychological approach. And what's so surprising is, I'll just read this because it's what I wrote. "And while James, Jung, Campbell, Ettinger, and a few other 20th century thinkers, influenced by modern science, wrote about the psychological nature of the gods and the god image, Wilson and the newly sober cohorts of the alcoholic squad of the Oxford group as early as 1934 had found a way to treat alcoholism using a similar approach. Yet, as we'll see in the next few chapters, its roots predate the late 19th and early 20th century visionaries. In the West, there were a few medieval Christian mystics who had first employed something akin to a psychological perspective, prompting Jung to admit that in modern times we've only rediscovered the gods as such." And so Jung had discovered that this psychological approach to religious symbolism was so important, and he studied this from a scientific perspective. And little did he know, in fact, he didn't know, in fact, nobody knows except for us, is that over here in New York and Akron in 1934, Bill Wilson and a bunch of loser alcoholics were actually using the same approach as a treatment for alcoholism. And that is a profound and a really important thing. And we're going to see more about this. I like what Schaberg says, right? This was a breathtaking innovation, and it certainly is breathtaking. So this brings us to Miester Eckhart, the Dominican. And so and he plays a key role for this, and he's going to come up again in later chapters. But that Jung was really obsessed with Eckhart as a teenager. So if you recall, Jung's father was a pastor of the Swiss Reformed Church, and Jung was a rebellious guy, and he was obviously a super smart kid, and he loved to read, and he would read Meister Eckhart and Nietzsche and stuff, and Goethe and just whoever else, and then he would get in arguments with his father about theological stuff, right? And as we saw in his interpretation of the Book of Job, Jung was thinking about this stuff in a whole different way. So he fell in love with Eckhart early on, and it was mostly because of the way Eckhart talked about the God image. So and Jung would later say that it was Eckhart who led him to spiritus, or the breath of life. So, and real quickly, regarding Miester Eckhart, I pulled this off AI. I Googled it, and it was just so good, I thought I'd use it. It says, and this is what Google says. According to Eckhart, the Imago Dei, or the image of God, which is, by the way, where Jung got the concept of the God image, is not simply a physical likeness, but rather a deep spiritual potential within the human soul. Essentially a spark of the divine intellect that allows humans to participate in God's own being through contemplation, in a profound union with the divine through the ground of the soul. And the ground of the soul is really important, because that is the objective psyche, right? Jung talks about the background of the psyche, and that ground of the soul is the collective unconscious, right? And so basically about Eckhart, so he wrote all this stuff, and he was this really big thinker, and obviously the church didn't like it, and he was tried for heresy, right? And the charge against him was for leading simple and uneducated people into error. And he actually died before they got to him. Maybe they were able to delay it or something, because he was already an old man, so he died. And when he died, they destroyed most of his writings, but somebody was smart enough to stow away some of the stuff, and then it later came to light in the 19th century. And it becomes, so this stuff, and we can see this from the AI description, is that his stuff is really, it's really relatable to Eastern philosophy, right? So the reason his writings became really important even to William James and to Carl Jung was that they were comparing this Christian mysticism to Eastern religion and Eastern religious ideas, right? So and James was kind of the pioneer, I think, of that kind of angle of looking at Eastern religion from a Western point of view. And they realized that Meister Eckhart was kind of the first to do it, although he didn't have any access to Eastern thought, right? Eckhart lived in the 13th century. The East and West hadn't really met by then. Probably there was some interaction, but not, theologically. With all that can be said about Eckhart's writings, what we really want to look at here is really just the way he conceived of the God image, because that it's sort of our own conception of God as we understood him really grows out of Eckhart, in as much as Eckhart was so influential on both William James and Carl Jung. And what I found that this does is understanding this train of thought. It kind of helps us to connect back, right? And that's a nice thing. It's nice to connect back to our spiritual ancestors. So Jung says this about Eckhart: nothing is known, unfortunately, of Eckhart's personal life that would explain how he was led to his knowledge of the soul. But the meditative air with which he says in his discourse on repentance, and still today one seldom finds, that people who come to great things without first they go somewhat astray, permits the inference that he wrote from personal experience. Strangely appealing is Eckhart's sense of an inner affinity with God when contrasted to the Christian sense of sin. We feel ourselves transported back into the spacious atmosphere of the Upanishads, and that's the Eastern text. Eckhart must have experienced a quite extraordinary enhancement of the value of the soul, i.e., of his own inner being, that enabled him to rise to a purely psychological and relativistic conception of God and of his relation to man. The discovery and painstaking exposition of the relativity of God to man and the soul seemed to me, Jung, one of the most important landmarks on the way to a psychological understanding of religious phenomena, serving at the same time to liberate the religious function from the cramping limitations of intellectual criticism, though this criticism, of course, must not be denied its dues. And what I want to just say right here is that if Jung had this much to say about Eckhart, who is really almost a pretty obscure theologian, imagine if Carl Jung would have been more familiar with the 12 steps, what he might have said about Bill Wilson's philosophies, right? Because it's one thing for these guys to be writing about this stuff and having these discussions, these sort of cramped intellectual, discussions in the back rooms of churches, right? But what Bill Wilson does is he comes along and creates this worldwide organization based on the relativity of the God image. And so if Eckhart was a landmark, right, on the way to our psychological understanding, or we could say if Eckhart becomes a landmark on the way to the emergence of this new God image, then what will historians say of Bill Wilson in 100, 200, 300 years, once they realized that he had essentially developed something of a religion or a cult or something that used this same kind of concept, right? This sort of spiritual democracy that we celebrate. When I found this and I was writing about it, it struck me very deeply, and that's why I want to kind of harp on it a little bit. I kind of toned it down for the book. Here's what I say. Here we see echoes of Wilson's approach come through in Jung's assessment of Eckhart. The ancient mystic could already sense the emergence of the spiritual malady forming in Western consciousness even back then, and it inspired him to search within just as it has done for us. Jung says that Eckhart's conception of God was relativistic, growing out of a careful examination of his own inner being, further highlighting the subjective nature of every myth of expanding consciousness. Ironically, it was Wilson's underscoring of the subjectivity of his own conception of the God image that made it suffice. Wilson says, our own conception, however inadequate, was enough to make the approach. As we explored in the last chapter, in the 12 steps, the relativity of God is the cornerstone upon which our spiritual structure is built, the very thing that empowers us to see ourselves and the world around us through the great reality. And so there it is, right? And the paradox is that it's the inadequate conception of God, when we wrestle with it honestly and it's really our own, that's what creates the power to transform, right? That it's not the almighty God that's making these changes, it's our own inadequate conceptions. On the other hand too, something that I realize is that it's also our inadequate belief that creates these changes, right? Because an inadequate belief is better than somebody who confesses all the faith in the world, as long as it's honest. So that's the key to this this whole thing, right? It's that, what is the God image for me, right? Is it just a beaver hiding in a cave? Well, it might be. But I can do my own research in this and really flush this out and figure out what it means to me. And when I do that, it's going to unleash powers that come within me that I didn't know I had access to before. The symbols, they're reflections of psychological energies, right? These, and we're going to talk about this in the next chapter when we dip into the numinosum, is that we're not speaking about anything that exists outside of us. Everything we talk about in terms of these symbols is happening within. And so once the symbols start to change within us, then we start to change from the inside out. Tucked into his commentary regarding Eckhart, Jung explains that access to the numinosity of the religious archetype that Jung explains that to access the numinosity of the religious archetype, we must recognize it as a subjective construct, and that we can't arrive at such a perspective until we quit fetching God from without. And I love that term, right? Because, you know, and just think of Wilson's experience, right? Wilson's experience really underlies this whole thing, is that he comes up against the czar of heaven, right? And he says, I just couldn't stomach it. Like, I just couldn't believe in the same God that I believed in. And then what he did is he turned inward, and he discovers something more profound and more helpful. And this is Jung here. He says, the relativity of God, this dynamic conception of God, implies a reciprocal and essential relation between man and God, whereby man can be understood as a function of God and God as a psychological function of man. So, like, for example, Job would have been a function of God, right? Job allowed the God image to realize that it needed to become human and do some growing, right? And yet, it's also a psychological function of man, in that Job is just accessing this sort of image, but it's all taking place within him. So that sort of delineates what Jung's saying here. From the metaphysical point of view, God is, of course, absolute, existing in himself. So the metaphysical point of view, for those who weren't here the last couple of weeks, that's the basic conventional conception. That is the God, the czar of heaven is the metaphysical point of view. This implies a complete detachment from the unconscious, or from the psyche in general, which means psychologically a complete unawareness of the fact that God's actions spring from one's own inner being. The relativity of God, on the other hand, means, and think about Bill Wilson right here, the relativity of God, on the other hand, means that not inconsiderable portion of the unconscious processes is registered, at least indirectly, as a psychological content. Naturally, this insight is possible only when more attention than usual is paid to the psyche. Now, Bill Wilson is a great example of this, because on one hand, Bill was paying so much attention to his psyche that he recognized that there was a thing inside of his brain that he called the alcoholic mind, that every so often would take over and cause him to drink against his will. So that's what Jung says is, and this allowed Wilson to then stumble into this, this inadequate conception of God. So on both hands, right, what it's showing is that a considerable portion of the unconscious process is being registered. In other words, he's becoming more and more conscious of what's taking place in the psyche. That is the definition of a spiritual awakening. 2 years after he wrote the big book, this is what Bill says. This is what he calls this. He's talking about this psychological process. He says, and this is in the appendix in the back of the big book, among our rapidly growing membership of thousands of alcoholics, such transformations, though frequent, and he's defining the spiritual experience here, the spiritual awakening. Such transformations, though frequent, are by no means the rule. Most of our experiences are what the psychologist William James calls the educational variety, because they develop slowly over a period of time. Quite often, friends of the newcomer are aware of the difference long before he himself is. He finally realizes that he has undergone a profound alteration in his reaction to life, that such a change could hardly have been brought about by himself alone. What often takes place in a few months could seldom have been accomplished by years of self-discipline. With few exceptions, our members find that they have tapped an unsuspected inner resource, which they presently identify with their own conception of a power greater than themselves. And then in the next paragraph, he calls it God consciousness. So that unsuspected inner resource is what Jung was referring to in the last slide as this, as that we're registering this unconscious process as part of the psyche, right? That just like the alcoholic problem exists within, it appears from our experience that the solution, or the higher power, also exists within as well. And like we saw last session, Bill Wilson says specifically, it was only there that he could be found, the God idea. This is what I wrote. Ironically, a conventional approach not only blocks us from recognizing that our troubles are of our own making, but it also prohibits us from recognizing our own divinity, as Jung explains in the foregoing quote. Thus, to become aware that the power of God emanates from a hidden source deep within the psyche requires first that we pierce through our metaphysical preconceptions about the God image, an attitude which unfortunately does not come about without a considerable amount of psychological pain sine qua non for an encounter with the numinosum. Ming might be mad at me for the way I pronounce that. Wilson was inclined to register his own experience of the absolute as a function of the psyche as well. Writing 2 years after the big book was published, that he had tapped an unsuspected inner resource similar to what Jung calls the transcendent function of the psyche. And while we note that such a God consciousness constitutes a relative psychological construct, it is the very thing that makes it sufficient to change us. Nonetheless, Jung says it has absolute ascendancy over the will of the subject and can therefore bring about or enforce actions and achievements that could never be done by conscious effort. And that it's very similar to what Wilson says, right? Is that we accomplish things that we could never accomplish on our own. And yeah, so and we're going to kind of shift directions now. There's sort of a soapbox here at the end of this chapter, and I'm going to tie it back into the beginning of the chapter as best I can. So the deeper we dig into the psyche, the deeper we walk into the unconscious, right? As we turn and we go inward, we're going to encounter the God image. We're going to encounter our own pain and our own brokenness, right? And then as we go deeper, the nature of the symbols begins to change. And the symbols get older and older, right? And that I try to do this in the book too, is that we're sort of trying to go back in history, I guess. So we've just seen that our conception, right, this relativistic conception, is really an idea that Eckhart, the Miester Eckhart, had talked about so many centuries ago, and that Jung was aware that this conception was highly related to conceptions from Eastern religion. And so what we find then is that when we start to use a psychological approach and we start to understand what it is that we're actually doing around here in the 12 steps, is that our we start to notice so many kind of relationships and synchronicities with concepts from other religions, right? Except the thing is, we're not adopting those other religions and sort of trying to, as Jung says, pump them into our barren souls. But we just find that these other approaches are sort of the base of the way other older traditions access the numinosity of the symbols. So this section is called an Eastern approach. And while Western religions have spent centuries concretizing their various creeds and doctrines regarding the immutability of the absolute, what took place in the quiet recesses of the soul of an ancient mystic, when the God image began to register as an aspect of his own interior being, was of historical, theological importance. Jung comments that Eckhart's relativistic conception of God was a landmark on the way to a psychological understanding of religious phenomena, ultimately paving the way for each of us to rediscover the gods as a psychic factor. And as Eckhart's philosophies reconnect us to our Western theosophical roots, they also show us where our modern spiritual practice resembles that of the ancient East. We got a glimpse of this when Jung pointed out that reading Eckhart transports us back into the spacious atmosphere of the Upanishads. Our emerging notion of God as an inner resource, while distinct from the typically concretized Western God image, is akin to a religious concept from the East known as Brahman, described by Jung as the breath of life and the cosmic principle. And so what we're going to see later on is that Jung actually pulls from the Upanishads and from William James and from Miester Eckhart when he was essentially drafting his own conception of God, which he called the self. And the self is, they're essentially, the self is the God image, right? The self isn't God, but the self and the God image they're essentially the same thing. So, and the whole point of this then is that there's power to be found just by looking inside, right? That even though these other systems may have, ideas and stuff that are super helpful for us, like we can actually discover the same energies and the same concepts inside of ourselves once we kind of know what we're looking for. Um, so, and Joseph Campbell had a lot to say about this, and I love this quote. This is one of my favorite quotes, and it didn't make it into the book, but this is what Campbell says: history is not, as we well know, the actual source or primary reference of mythological symbols. In other words, he's really referring to our Western religion here, is that we don't read the Garden of Eden thinking we're reading a history book, right? We don't read the Old Testament. We don't even read the New Testament with the idea that we're reading a history book. At least we shouldn't, because if we do that, we lose access to the numinosity. Remember last week, he said that when the symbols become final terms in themselves, then they basically get cut off from conscious connection. So history is not the actual source of these symbols. They are psychological archetypes known to all mythologies. That is why at this time, the gurus and roshis from India and Japan are having such a profound influence and exerting such attraction on Westerners, particularly young people. This is why. They are telling our flocks that the reference of these universal symbols lies within themselves. The Western institutions should understand that they are right and recall that they possess the very same symbols on the altars of their churches. We Westerners also have the same spiritual lessons in the words of many of our greatest mystics. And this is important because, and I'm going to tie this in more, but if once, remember that the ego, our consciousness has developed alongside our God images, right? And that those two psychological complexes, the ego and the God image, the unconscious, it's really the consciousness and the unconscious, they vibrate at the same frequency, right? So we don't need to just go try to find another God image because we think the symbols from our own side of the world don't really have any meaning anymore because we can't interpret them historically, right? That we want to try to look at them from a different perspective and see them as sort of these instruments that we can use for transformation. Because in my experience, I had, so I, you know, this is not like this all comes from my personal experience because I've done this whole thing of like trying to adopt Eastern forms of practice and like, and I'm not saying that stuff wasn't beneficial, but that once I figured out that the symbols from my own culture had meaning for me and I started looking at it that way, then a whole new world opened up. And it was something that I would have never been able to access by only focusing on one kind of, on something that was like foreign. So this is what I write. Actually, this is Jung. By an inevitable decree of fate, the West is becoming acquainted with the peculiar facts of Eastern spirituality. It is useless to either belittle these facts or build false and treacherous bridges over yawning gaps. Instead of learning the spiritual techniques of the East by heart and imitating them in a thoroughly Western way, imitatio Christi, with a correspondingly forced attitude, it would be far more to the point to find out whether there exists in the unconscious, or in me, an introverted tendency similar to that which has become the guiding spiritual principle of the East. We should then be in a position to build on our own ground, our own psychic ground, and with our own methods that we really develop for ourselves. If we snatch these ideas directly from the East, we have merely indulged our Western acquisitiveness, confirming yet again that everything good is outside, whence it has to be fetched and pumped into our barren souls. It seems to me that we have really learned something from the East when we understand that the psyche contains riches enough without having to be primed from outside. And when we feel capable of evolving out of ourselves with or without divine grace, we must get at the Eastern values from within and not from without, seeking them in ourselves in the unconscious. And Bill Wilson is the perfect example of how effective such a method can be. Bill did not become a guru from some other culture, which he certainly could have, right? Instead, he just really developed a system out of his own psyche and his own experience, and by relating to his own inadequate conceptions of these God images. And by doing that, he created his own myth. And by creating his own myth, look at all the good that it did in the world. um, the problem with religion, both East and West, right? And this is only really for the way the Western mind perceives this, is that it's pointing to something out there. Jung uses the word acquisitiveness, right? And that's really the whole, I mean, the Western culture is founded on this idea, right? This materialistic acquisitiveness, right? That we need to get stuff and make it our own, and that's what makes it work. When really the thing that we're looking for already exists within us. And I like this because it's really kind of tells us exactly why. Jung implored Western agnostics to think carefully before trying to adopt Eastern or primitive forms of spirituality, warning against using it as yet another attempt to avoid one's own dark corners. While it is true that Eastern myth contains useful spiritual concepts of even greater value to us, would be risking an adventure inward to see what kind of cosmic connection we might discover by examining our own shadow and integrating our own demons. Until then, Jung warns that to try to adopt Eastern forms of spirituality only serves to distract the weary Westerner from the one thing that could actually fix it, right? And that's the journey within. And I want to do another prompt real quick. And okay, so we did the one earlier about the God image. So keep that one on the back burner for now. But I want to do another one. And same thing. So we're gonna calm down for a second. I'm gonna breathe and give some space so you can clear your mind. And then I'm gonna give you a prompt. And when I do that, just remember what it is. Remember whatever symbol comes up, whatever image it is. All right. So just a couple seconds of silence here. All right. So I want you to picture the face of evil. Just picture the face of evil. All right. And I want you to remember whatever image that was for you. And perhaps it's related to the God image. Maybe it's the same image as the God image. Maybe it's just a pink elephant and none of this makes sense anyways. All of that is perfectly fine. But this kind of exercise right here, right, when we're actually looking inside of ourselves for our own connection to the unconscious, regardless of what the Buddha says, regardless of what Miester Eckhart says, regardless of what Eckhart Tolle says, is what is it within us? What does our own connection look like? I'm going to suggest that those images and that method could inform your life better than any other spiritual practice that you can engage in, if you're willing to later on sort of, more fully engage with these images and these symbols, the ones that are coming from deep inside. So this is the last paragraph in the chapter. It says, because the Eastern religious attitude is psychological by nature, instead of trying to practice Eastern methods in our own thoroughly Western way, which is the only way we know, we can seek out the same insights that draw us to Eastern traditions within our own psyche. Wilson's is a perfect case in point that the psyche is primed for a fullness of spiritual experience, needing little outside influence from any religion, East or West, to activate. Wilson began his journey by adopting a relative perspective of the Western God image, and that allowed him to build a bridge over the yawning gap that prevents Westerners from successfully practicing Eastern or primitive spirituality by itself. Wilson thus arrived at the same techniques, the guiding spiritual principles of the East, what Jung calls them, by searching for meaning and value within his own cultural context, showing us how to mine the gems we hope to discover from other cultures' religions directly from within. Wilson's myth of expanding consciousness, though highly correlated with Eastern and primitive forms, emerged out of the ground of his own psyche, sparked by his earnest engagement with the religious symbols with which he was already familiar. That, in turn, allowed him to address the fundamental needs of his Western point of view, including a reconciliation with the all-outside God image, as well as his need for individuality. offering further evidence that deep down all humans are connected by way of our shared longing for psychological union with the divine. And I want to focus on that last sentence because it's really important and it's really easy to skip over, and I didn't flesh it out too much in the book. As Westerners, we have these two fundamental needs, right? Because we are Westerners and this is just the way we see the world. It just is. It's like it's literally our operating system. You know, you can't just download a Windows operator or a Windows program onto a Mac. It doesn't work. So we want, and when we address those needs, right, there's basically two needs, right? One is a reconciliation with the all outside God image, right? And the God image is a uniquely Western concept, anyways. In the East, as far as I know, and I don't know a lot, but they don't necessarily have the same kind of idea about God or the God image that we do, right? It's more fundamental than that. It's not necessarily a being, it's more of like an energy or something. So it's a far more kind of archaic or ancient perspective. We have adopted this concept of the God image because our God became human, right? Like in the grand cultural context, that's what happened. It doesn't mean that I'm a Christian just because God became human, right? But it's just the way that our psyches have developed over time. They've developed around this kind of idea. So the first thing that Wilson does is shows us how to essentially reconcile with the all outside God image. And it's very simple. Why don't you choose your own conception of God, right? It's a very simple process, but it's something that has to be done. The next one has to do with this idea of individuality. And this goes back to the earlier slides, right? The ego develops alongside the God image, right? And the Western ego has a desire for individuality. That's like the thing. That's why all of our cultural myths and like, you know, it's all about the hero, right? The hero's journey. The hero does amazing things, right? And becomes the savior, right? That's a uniquely Western idea. And it's that stuff speaks so deeply to us because that is the way our brains are programmed to work. So what happens then, and I'm just going to read this right now, is because we need a spiritual program that allows us to pursue that individuality. And that's exactly the opposite of what we see taking place in the East. So this is a paragraph that didn't make it into the book, but it says, for while the Eastern mind has no difficulty of conceiving of consciousness without an ego, it is not an aspect of our psyche that we Westerners can get along without. In fact, the notion of egoic differentiation appears as foreign to an Eastern person as their egoic dissolution idea is to us, where they say that the ego finally dissolves into the eternal night of the universe like a salt doll that has walked into the ocean. And, you know, we're going to talk more about the ego a little later on and just try to define what the ego is, even, which I find to be, there's a lot of confusion around this because of the way we've almost tried to adopt this Eastern form when we talk about the ego, but then we don't really know what the ego is. And then we say we want to kill the ego. But if we were, you know, it's like if we were to kill the ego, there would be nobody left to know that the ego died, right? The ego is literally it is the way we experience the world and conceive of the world. And so the concept, the process that we're engaged in is not to destroy the ego, but to actually individuate the ego and to help to wake it up. So, and once we understand that the ego evolves with the God image, and we understand how these two things interrelate, and that once the God image changes, the ego can change, and vice versa, then we're really going to start to have a new experience. So hopefully, you guys were able to follow along. And I'm going to stop the sharing now. And I will turn it back over to the bus driver.
Hey, Duncan back here. Cody, thank you so much. Let's make it so everyone can unmute. Yes, please unmute and let's join together in a collective cacophony of
Yay.
appreciation.
Let's go,
Thank you,
boy.
Cody.
Love
All
it.
right.
Thank you so
All right.
much.
Fifth dimension
Mind-blowing.
stuff.
Thank
Thank you.
Yeah.
That was wonderful.
Cody.
Oh,
Thank you,
oh,
Cody.
Pretty good.
oh
Thank you,
boy.
Cody.
Multiverse.
Transforming.
Thank you.
Wow. Okay.
Provoking. Hey, I put my hand up. Oh.
All right. Wow. You know, this is amazing. This is like it's both exhausting to follow and really gets me going all at the same time. I'm not sure whether to take a nap right now or, follow through with facilitating the Q&A session. Let's do the Q&A session. Let me see if I have to tell you anything before we do that. This is the time we'll open for questions and answers. Each person will have 1 minute to reflect or ask a question. Please get to a question. You will hear a sound come on at the 1 minute mark. Please wrap up. And Cody will do his best to answer. So if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand and I will call on people and ask you to unmute. Oh, you've stumped the crowd today, Cody. You have stumped the crowd. There's not a single question. People are not sure what, oh, Despina will think of something. Come on, Despina.
Okay, thank you. My hand, I have to put it up 3 times. Thank you, Cody, the Spina addict. And are you familiar with the film The Lost Years of Jesus Christ? It's a documentary, and it is about his younger years in India and documentation that's in India about him visiting there, um, which is where he developed a lot of his mystical tools. And of course, the church has denied it because well, we understand why the church would deny this since but we have nothing is written on what he did before what age 32 is pretty much when he comes on the scene. So this is all the earlier years. Have you seen this documentary?
No, I have not. And I mean, not to say, so this is how I would respond to that kind of an idea, which, regardless of whether it's historically true or not,
Mm-hmm.
I feel like philosophically, there could be there's certainly some connection, but mythologically speaking, like you would say, oh, Jesus, he went into the wilderness, right, and he came back out with these fundamental concepts, these fundamental ideas, and then he was able to share them with other people. You could also say the same thing of the Buddha, right? So the question is
Yeah.
whether Buddha and Jesus went to the same forest, right? And got the same information. So that's the idea here. Again, the idea that the historical Jesus went to the historical country of India, to me, that doesn't, it's not, that's not really the question, right? Because Jesus is a symbol.
Yeah,
Jesus
he's
Christ,
not a fictional character. I mean, you have some schools of thought that say he's a fictional character.
yeah, and even but I would say he's much more than a fictional character, right?
What he represents.
Winnie the Pooh is a fictional character. Um, so 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 there's something more profound and life-changing about a religious symbol that's not just a fictional character. So there's meaning there that can be mined for myself when I look at those things as actually as mirrors of my own experience. So that would be my response. So
Okay. Well, thank you. I have to go to work. I was so glad I was able to put it out there. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Nikki, come on in.
Hi, I'll turn my camera on. Hi there, thank you for your reading. Cody, did you ever have a struggle with the concept of God or higher power?
yeah, I mean, my story is surprisingly familiar to Bill Wilson's. when I was young, I didn't grow up in a religious home, and we never really talked about God. So I didn't know really anything about this thing. It just hadn't really crossed my mind. When I was young, a friend of mine decided to go on an LDS Mormon mission. So Mormons are essentially Christians with a little bit of different ideas, but essentially it's a Christian mythology. So I decided to go on a mission too, and I had some spiritual experiences, right? But they actually happened to me before I was kind of indoctrinated. And when I was still really naive, uh, I was able to access this power. But I think what happened was after I became indoctrinated, that the symbol I was really cut off from the symbols of numinosity, right? Because I started thinking that, oh, these things are, this is the way it is, this is over here, this is a concrete thing, this is a historical event. And when that happened, I lost access to it. So, but when I came into rehab and AA and NA and whatever, I was invited to choose my own conception of God. And that was like over, 20 years ago. Um, and so I started to wrestle with a different conception of God. And then I went through all sorts of different avenues, including the ones that I put up with of the Eastern guys and Eckhart Tolle. And what happened to me most recently was I started reading Joseph Campbell again, because when I got sober this time, I just thought, I'm not going to have an opinion about what the God image is. I just don't know. I came full circle and I started reading Joseph Campbell, and then he turned me on to Carl Jung, and reading Jung is what really kind of has allowed for me my sort of all of my experience, all of my understanding of the Christian myth and everything else to really kind of sort of coagulate into this one single sort of perspective that's now evolving on its own. So that's my story.
Thank you. Michelle S., come in.
Thank you. I don't know if I have a question in all of this. I am just like, wow, 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 because I really I didn't understand before listening to you and the work that you're doing here, understand the ego. I just didn't get it. And now I feel like I get it a lot more than I did before. And let's see, I was struck by the part, I think it was where Jung was saying to not look at don't adopt new symbols. I'm not saying it at all how he said it, but basically it was this idea of like, you don't need to go a new path with like an Eastern religion or look all these other places, but that, the symbols maybe of your youth would be the ones that maybe just need meaning or something. And so that's kind of where I have been a lot of my life. I heard that is just, I was born into a very traditional Catholic upbringing with zero spirituality. And so I'm just I've always been curious, I've always had to define God because my parents didn't tell me about it, but I wanted to know. So I'm just kind of curious what Jung says about not to pursue a new path, even though I kind of want to. I want to. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, you'll be glad to know, or at least I was interested to know, that Jung said that I think it was in the late 50s or the mid 50s. He said that of all of the clients who had come to see him for help, probably thousands, right? That there was only like 5 Catholics that it came, but lots of Protestants, fewer Jewish people. So, so he was super supportive of like the Catholic faith, because back then they were speaking Latin, so there was a lot of engagement with the symbols. There was a lot of engagement with this sort of this pantheon of like Catholic saints and stuff. And I don't know anything about Catholicism, but but I think I really appreciate where you're at, because I think that really is the point of what I'm trying to get across with the book, right? And with, today's lesson, is that what we're the what we're trying to do is find something within us. We are the North Star, right? All of the other things, they're useful kind of constructs, but they're almost just more like, they allow us to start. So writing this book, for example, for me, it was really the first time I had engaged with these ideas in this sort of symbolic, creative way. And what emerged was like other symbols, right? Like the archetype of the alcoholic and my relationship to that symbol. I also started to look at the fall a little bit differently, and the atonement, right? And just the symbol of Jesus. And when I started to engage in this different way, then the symbols began to really speak to me at a much lower level, which was, and I found it to be really powerful. And it's interesting, because it's not just like that I have these sort of intellectual, like aha moments, right? But that things actually started to change in like in life too. The way I was interacting with other people and everything else. So that's why I say, like, the numinosity really is found. What we're trying to do here is, you know, the problem we can have is this thing of spiritual bypass. That for me, like, I want this. I want to sit down in the morning. I want to do my meditation and just feel really good. I want to feel really connected, right? And that's the same thing I wanted when I was using drugs and alcohol, right? And not that there's anything wrong with wanting to feel that way. Like, who doesn't want to feel good? But just because I'm feeling good doesn't mean I'm accessing this deeper power that can change me inside. And that comes through engaging with the symbols. And I didn't say this yet, but what becomes more and more apparent as we go through this work is that I start to see that the way the symbols are, and the way they change, and how they begin to interact with each other in my mind, is that's really reflective of this change that's occurring actually inside of me, in my unconscious, that I couldn't see anyways. So what's happening is the unconscious is actually going to project into my field of view, whether it's in my dreams, active imaginations, whatever it is, that they begin to demonstrate that there's a deeper change happening inside of me that can only be expressed through symbols anyways. So I really like where you're at with that.
Thank you. We have some questions in the chat. I want to bring one in now. Is this Cody's way of expanding on steps 2, 3, and 11? I thought it might be a deep dive into these steps. What do you have to say about that?
I mean, I love that, because in fact, I just wrote a paper that was essentially like a step 2, so it is more of this book is my step 2, I think. And step 3, I talk about step 3 in the book, and I think it's an important notion, right? That I sort of, and it's more of this this decision, right, to turn my will and my life over to the care of God. But then what is God, right? So for me, God is that psychic ground that we've been talking about, right? The soul, the ground of the soul. It's the part of my psychology or my psyche that I can't see and that I'm unaware of. That to me is God. So, or the God image, I guess.
Thank you, Jim.
Excuse me, Duncan, thank you. Cody, that was another absolutely brilliant, really deep lecture. Thank you. I was really interested in the ideas that you were putting forward regarding Job and the God image. It's almost as if, by sending Jesus by coming down and taking a human form, is God has a conscience. You know, that presenting that sort of idea. When you were talking about it at that time, you were using AI as, you know, some great AI somewhere, wherever it may be, in the deep recesses of your mind, AI sort of controlling all of this. So that brings me to my question. Because you were speaking about Yahweh at that time as well. That's an Old Testament figure. So given where we are with artificial intelligence today, and it is AI, do you believe that AI is becoming the new God image? And if that is the case, then we're moving back to an Old Testament style, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, a vengeful God, as opposed to a New Testament, peaceful, spiritual God. So AI becomes the new God image.
Yeah, I mean, so before I talk about the AI, I I would invite you or just us collectively to consider that we like to think that the God became this sort of loving creature in the New Testament, but then that same God demanded Jesus's blood, who was a perfect individual, just like Job. So the question of this like loving, like, you know, this goes back to the step 3 thing, right? We turn our will and our lives over to the care of God. What does that mean? Does that, because if I turn myself into the judge for a warrant, I'm turning myself over to the care of the judge, right? Who's going to lock me up. So even the definition of what the care of God is, right, is sort of up for grabs. And, you know, the book is called The Shadow of a Figure of Light. And so part of the question that I ask is like, these God images that we hold as these figures of light, what is their shadow? And so that's just a concept to think about. Regarding the AI thing, so I feel like whatever's most important is biological for me. And more natural. So, but that's not to say that the AI concept of and you know, whether we're in a simulation and stuff like that, the point of that is that it is a symbol of the self, right? Like that is so. And Jung would have really loved this whole thing about AI and stuff, because what it is, especially the concept of like whether we're in a simulation, and this occurs with people who also really love like conspiracies, right? Is that we project our unconscious processes, we project them outside into the universe. So we're projecting, oh, this must be a simulation because there's something in charge that I can't see. But that what that thing is actually is the self. It's the internal thing that's actually in charge. So the same thing happens with conspiracies, right? Oh, there's a cabal, there's something that's like running the world, and right, and not to say that those things aren't happening, but to think that it's completely dominating my life, while I'm failing to look at my own shadow, and do my own work. There's a disconnect there. So I'm just projecting out into the world. So the alchemists, by the way, they were projecting that unconscious process into chemicals and substances and scientific procedures, that and so it's kind of the same thing. So yeah.
Thank
So
you. Still have a couple more questions in the chat. I'm not sure if we'll get all to all those, and still here's the next one. Just thinking about animals, why do we think we are the God image and animals or plants are not? Is there an aspect of human inflation? I think what Jung, or what is being discussed here, the growing consciousness, the growing of God as to Job, may have taught God to be gentler on us, but was wondering about animals. How do we treat them as less because they're not self-reflective? God equal in everything on the planet? What do you think?
Well, I appreciate the question, because I think that the nature of the journey leads us back towards oneness with everything. So and like for me personally, like I try not to treat animals like less, than equal members of the family or whatever. But so I think that there's something to be said though, that and obviously there's a lot of research and stuff about animals now and how they mourn each other when they die. And so like I'm not saying that they don't have consciousness or whatever. It's certainly beyond my ability to understand or recognize or anything what they experience. Same with plants, right? So I'm just talking about my experience and my relationship to my own unconscious. So that's just like that's stuff that I just don't necessarily understand. So that would be my response.
Thanks. Patrick in Cologne.
Yeah, good evening from Cologne. That was pretty amazing. My brain is a bit fried, but I'll try it nonetheless. Earlier in the conversation, I was reminded of something that was said to me many years ago by an American, that the true meaning of the letter CIA is Catholic Irish alcoholic. And I remember as a child feeling, even as a young child, that there was far too much emphasis on the Jesus aspect and way too little emphasis and focus on the Christ light aspect of Jesus Christ. And it was pursuing the Christ light aspect that has been the driver of my spiritual journey since childhood. So I want to come back to Job, and a point that you made. You said that that our psychological perception of God was evolving, and that at the same time as the myth was evolving, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the question, and at the same time, we can see that the universe is evolving, right? But I would challenge that statement that the myth is evolving, because we are the ones who are evolving the myth. The myth is not evolving itself. Or would you argue otherwise, Cody?
Yeah, I mean that's right, because the myth is actually just coming as it develops alongside of us. Like it is part of our own expression, right? So it's a reflection of the evolving psyche and the culture and the collective evolves, the myth evolves. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that. The myth is not separate from the human mind. Yeah. So I think that's thanks for pointing that out. I think it's an important distinction. So
Thank you. Last question I have in the chat. What would you suggest for someone who was raised in a fanatically Christian home with an abusive father figure who used the Christian image of God as a representative of and condoner of abusive behavior? The Western image of God does not work for me. I see God as being responsible for most of the atrocities of the modern world.
So I really appreciate that. And what's most important, I think, is the honest engagement with the idea. And to recognize that somebody else's conception of any deity doesn't necessarily have to determine the way I conceive of it. So, for example, I'm not a Christian. I don't think that Jesus will save me when I die. There's just absolutely nothing about me that is a Christian. However, that doesn't mean that I don't see a certain level of profound meaning within the Christian myth. So even so, for example, one way to look at the myth as a sort of reflection would just be to say, like, well, Jesus's father was also abusive, right? But something good came from that. So that sort of that situation that Jesus was born into, his stepfather was abusive, you could say, right? Joseph I guess Joseph was his stepfather, but when Jesus finally meets his real dad, right, it doesn't go very well. But something beautiful grows out of that interaction. That's how the myth speaks to me. Is that and Jesus, he comes forth as this new individual, right? He still looks the same because some of his disciples could recognize him, but he was different, right? Something fundamentally had changed inside of him. And so that's the story, right? We're talking about transformation. And so that's where I think the most meaning is found, is just because he was an individual who transformed. But that, and I just want to say too, so, and if I, so what I'm saying too is not to adopt these as our own sort of saviors, right? But it's just to recognize that, you know, as Jung says, like that these images, the God image can have many references, many different points to it, you know, and eventually we're going to call it the self. And so then we say that Jesus is a reflection of the self, right? That it's not even that the self reflects Jesus. Nope, it's the other way around. Jesus reflects the self. So
Thanks, Cody. I want to check in with you. It's the top of the hour. We're a couple minutes over the 90 minutes. We still have 3 hands in the audience. What would you like to do?
we'll keep going. We'll keep the recording going for now.
Jerry, come on in. Thank you, Cody.
Oh boy, I'm in a silly giddy way. But anyway, can we get to 100% consciousness, man? You know, it's so funny. I feel like we can. And also, you know, it's amazing how sleep can be a greater power than ourselves, how much can be revealed. Thank you.
Esther.
Hi, Cody. Thank you so much for your presentation. I apologize to the group because this may feel like a step backwards, but this is all, 12 step is not new to me, but this conversation is all very new to me. And so, and I'm not a religious person. So 2 questions. One, when God became human, who did he become, or what did he become? And the other is, what do we mean by the shadow self, or the shadow? I don't understand the concept.
Yeah. So I'll hit the shadow one first. So the shadow is the part of my psyche, or my own psychology, that lies just beyond my ability to see. So it's almost like in a dream, like a great metaphor for the shadow would be a backpack, right? It's this thing that's there, it's just right here, like I'm aware of it, but it's not something that I have conscious, you know, control of. So the shadow, in terms of psychological development, the shadow is the thing that when we turn inside and we start doing work, right? Like real work, not like the work like in the 12 steps is the perfect examples. We start to look at those parts of our own psychology and our own reactions to life that we don't actually have control over. So, for example, alcoholism or drug addiction or overeating and stuff, those are shadow sort of complexes, right? They tend to be shrouded behind delusion. You know, Jung says that with very little effort, relatively, a person can get to know one's shadow. So the shadow, you know, it's like, if I was really interested, I could just ask my wife or whoever I'm close to, you know, what about me don't I see? Right. So for example, like for me, like maybe I get mad and I start to groan and get grumpy and shoot glances with my eyes and stuff. And I don't really see it. I see her doing it. Right. But that's kind of some shadow interaction and stuff there. So that's what we mean when we talk about the shadow. It's that sort of dark side of ourselves that we don't quite become aware of consciously without doing some real self-reflection. Now to go back to the God image question. So I think the way Jung was really putting this out there was that God became human through Jesus, right? So that was the evolution. So Jesus, and so this is why the symbol of Jesus was such a moving symbol and literally just spread like wildfire until it almost took over the entire Western consciousness, was because God was now a human. That was a new idea, almost like a new technology that was just so amazing. It just took over the whole world, like electricity, or phones or whatever. So that, but the concept of that though, too. So it's not even necessarily, so we want to think of these things outside of the dogma and outside of the confines of the religion. Is that if I look at my own individual development, it's going to mirror the collective development that always happens, right? So what happens for me is I start thinking about God as an image, an outside image like Yahweh. And then through pain, I become a little more self-aware and self-reflective. And then what happens is that God image then sort of, I discover it within me. So now the God has become human in me. So that's one way to look at it. The other interesting thing about that is tradition number 2, which states that God can manifest himself in our group conscience. So that's another sort of iteration of God becoming human. And it's actually even more profound than Jesus being a human, because Jesus was perfect. Like, none of us are perfect. The idea that God manifests itself like in a group of drunks or drug addicts or whatever, that's a really progressive understanding of this thing called God that's becoming more and more and more human. So that, and I say this kind of near the end of the book, like the more the deeper we go into history, the more human God will become. So and we're seeing traces of that in the 12 steps, the 12 traditions. So yeah.
Thank you, Sandra.
Good evening, Sandra from South Africa. I'm an alcoholic. This has been so interesting, so exhausting. It's the first time that I've ever listened to anything as, I don't know if I should use the word controversial, but there's a couple of things that I just want to ask you or allude to. And I'm glad that you brought up the 12 steps, and step 3. The step 3 principle is faith. So, I almost agree with you in that we don't become an expression of Christ, because that's where my God of my understanding comes from. But he becomes a reflection of who we are supposed to become. So, but it's unctioned through faith. Because if you look at step 1, it is truth. And we've got to find that truth, and it happens within us. It doesn't happen externally. It's like a spiritual awakening that happens within us if we allow that to happen through honesty and humility. And then the second one is hope. Hope is something that we don't really see, but we know that within us we find that strength, and it's like nothing works in isolation. It's like the God of my understanding working within me, and I seeking to improve my conscious contact. So it all happens within me. So I think I sort of get that when you speak about Christ being a reflection of who we need to be. It's very interesting. But I still say, yeah, we the effort, as we make a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God, as we personally understand Him to be. It's all within us. So thank you. You really made me think. Thank you a lot.
Thank you, Sandra. Do you want to comment, Cody? Should we go to Hanlon? Hanlon, come on in. Asking you to unmute. Can you unmute? There. Oh, try again. There you go.
My name is Ann, and I am an alcoholic. I go to meetings at the meeting space, and they haven't got your book yet at in Houston, or not Houston. I'm in Las Vegas. But the question I have is that the light bearer, this alcoholic archetype, is that when we do 4 and 5, and we look at what I was mad at my wife about? There's a light that shines. What was my part in it? You know, how I humiliated her. You know, the idea that when we do shadow work, we're entering into like a beam of light that comes from high above, and we share it with other people. You know, and I mean, I just wanted you, because I learned about Jung through Hillman, and many years ago, and I just never thought about the archetype of of the alcoholic. But you know, when you start saying the shaman, and anyway, I guess the question I was going to ask, do you see that process we have in 4 and 5, and again at 10 and 11 when we share it with our fellowship? Is that the archetype that you're talking about, the light bearer that creates the story when we work these steps in all our affairs? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So also, if you find Lisa, she has a couple books of mine, so make sure that she'll get them to you. I'll tell her. So the archetype of the alcoholic is so I'm unfamiliar with the archetype of the light bearer. But the archetype of the alcoholic is actually what it has a duplex nature. So and we're going to talk about this, we're really starting to get into this stuff now, but that the archetype of the alcoholic, and Jung says this in his letter to Wilson, that you know he talks about the highest religious experience in comparison with the lowest, most depraving poison. And so the nature of all archetypes is that they come in pairs. But certain archetypes, like the alcoholic, are simply duplex, meaning that they wear the same guise in both the highest and the lowest. So in a way, the archetype is the light bearer, but the archetype of the alcoholic is the bringer of light, right? But the archetype of the alcoholic is also the one who brings darkness and death. And so that image itself is a paradoxical image of wholeness. And we're going to talk about wholeness as we go, but that we're not really, so that, you know, we have this sort of hyperfixation with these figures of light. Jung says that a man does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious, right? So when we do 4 and 5, for example, more than just bringing, so it is true, because we bring the darkness to light because we become conscious of it. So, but almost rather than walking into the light, I would suggest that the process of the steps is one that actually invites us to walk into the darkness, because the unconscious is dark. But that's where we have to do the work, right? We have to bring whatever it is that's unconscious in us. We're trying to bring that out into the open, so that because as long as it remains unconscious, it's gonna drive us without us even knowing it, right? So if we can bring it forth into consciousness, then it no longer has power over us the way it did before. We'll still experience compulsions to a certain extent, but now we have a different relationship with them because we understand that they're deriving from the self or from the unconscious. So
Thank you. Okay, I think we're finished. I think we are finished.
I'll stop the recording.